Part 1. The night he called me just a plumber. My son-in-law stood in the center of the room holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by real estate agents, investors, and wealthy clients. The house was full of laughter, expensive suits, and people talking about million-dollar deals. It was his big real estate celebration party, and I was standing quietly near the back wall. Then someone asked him a simple question. "Hey, Ryan, who's the older gentleman over there?" Ryan looked at me, then smirked. "Oh, him?" He laughed. "That's just my wife's dad. A retired plumber." A few people chuckled politely. "Nothing special," he added. "He used to fix pipes his whole life." The room laughed a little louder this time. I didn't say anything. I simply stood there holding my glass of water, because Ryan didn't know something very important. The luxury building he was celebrating tonight, the one he had been bragging about to everyone, I owned half of it, but I had never told him. You see, I spent 40 years working as a plumber, but what most people didn't know was that I had invested every spare dollar I earned. Small properties, apartment units, commercial spaces, piece by piece. By the time I retired, those investments had quietly turned into millions. My daughter knew, but Ryan never bothered to ask. To him, I was just an old man who fixed sinks. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Until that night, because the moment he called me just a plumber in front of everyone, something interesting happened. One of the investors at the table suddenly looked at me again. Really looked at me. Then his eyes widened slightly, like he had just recognized a face from somewhere. Ryan kept laughing with the crowd, but the investor slowly stood up and walked toward me. And what he said next made the entire room fall silent. If you enjoy dramatic family stories and shocking moments like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Because in part 2, the investor reveals who I really am, and Ryan's smile disappears instantly. Part 2. The man who recognized me. The investor walked straight toward me. The room was still loud with laughter, but he wasn't smiling. Instead, he studied my face carefully. For a moment, I wondered if I had met him somewhere before. Then he suddenly spoke. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Daniel Carter?" Ryan was still talking across the room when he heard the name. He turned around. "Yeah, that's him," Ryan said casually. "My father-in-law." The investor's expression changed completely. "You're that Daniel Carter?" he asked again. I nodded slowly. "Yes." The man immediately straightened his suit. Then, in front of everyone in the room, he extended his hand with deep respect. "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you." The noise in the room slowly faded. People started looking at us. Ryan frowned. "What's going on?" he asked. The investor shook my hand firmly. "You probably don't remember me," he said, "but 10 years ago I bought my first apartment building from your company." Now the entire room was quiet. Ryan blinked. "My company?" I could feel everyone staring. I smiled politely. I don't really run it anymore, I said. But you built Carter Property Holdings, the investor continued, and half the commercial buildings in this district are owned by your investment group. Someone across the room whispered. Wait, bet Carter? Ryan's face slowly changed. First confusion, then disbelief. Hold on, he said. You're saying my father-in-law owns real estate? The investor laughed softly. Owns real estate? He looked around the room. Your father-in-law is one of the largest silent investors in this city. Now the room was completely silent. Ryan's mouth opened slightly. But he's a plumber. I nodded calmly. I was. The investor smiled. And one of the smartest investors I've ever seen. Ryan looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under his feet. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Then he asked the question everyone in the room was thinking. You own buildings? I took a sip of water. A few. The investor chuckled. A few? He pointed out the window toward the city skyline. Mr. Carter owns 3 of the buildings you've been showing clients tonight. Ryan froze, because the building he had been bragging about all evening, the one he claimed was his biggest opportunity, was actually one of my properties. But the biggest shock of the night hadn't happened yet, because a few seconds later, Ryan proudly started explaining the deal he had been negotiating. And what he said next made me realize something very disturbing. In part 3, Ryan reveals a real estate deal he thinks he's about to close, not realizing he's talking to the person who actually owns the property. Part 3, the deal he didn't understand. Ryan cleared his throat and tried to recover his confidence. He forced a laugh. Well, I guess I should introduce everyone properly then. He walked toward me and placed a hand on my shoulder, trying to act friendly. This is Daniel Carter, my father-in-law, he said. But his voice sounded different now, more careful, more nervous. Then he turned back to the group of investors. As I was saying earlier, Ryan continued, the biggest deal I'm working on right now is the Riverside Plaza redevelopment project. Several investors nodded. That building is about to become the most valuable property in the district, Ryan said proudly. I've already convinced the owners to sell. Once the deal closes, we'll convert it into luxury apartments. Carl, who was standing near the back, slowly raised an eyebrow, because the building Ryan was talking about was mine. I stayed quiet. Ryan continued speaking with excitement. The owners are old investors who don't even live in the city anymore, he said. They have no idea how valuable the land has become. A few people laughed. Ryan grinned. I'm basically getting the place for half its real value. The room filled with impressed murmurs. That's a great deal, one investor said. Ryan nodded proudly. Oh, it gets better. Once we renovate it, we'll flip the entire property and make at least $10 million profit. I looked down at my glass, because Ryan had just revealed something very important. He thought he was negotiating with some unknown owner through middlemen, but he had no idea that the person controlling the final decision was standing right in front of him. Then Ryan turned toward me again. You probably wouldn't understand all this real estate stuff, though, he said casually. You spent your life fixing pipes. A few people laughed nervously. I smiled. You might be surprised. Ryan shrugged and looked back at the investors. The paperwork should be finalized tomorrow, he continued. The owner already agreed to the price. That was when the investor who had recognized me earlier spoke again. He looked directly at Ryan. Are you sure about that? Ryan nodded confidently. Absolutely. The investor slowly turned toward me. Mr. Carter, did you agree to sell Riverside Plaza? The entire room went silent. Ryan frowned. What do you mean? I set my glass down calmly. Then I looked directly at my son-in-law and said the words that changed the entire night. I didn't agree to sell anything. Ryan's face went completely white, because in that moment, he finally understood who he had been negotiating with all along. And the next thing he said was even more shocking. Part 4 will reveal the moment. Ryan realizes he's been trying to outsmart the man who actually owns the deal. Part 4. The moment his confidence collapsed. The room became so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Ryan stared at me like he had misunderstood what I just said. What do you mean you didn't agree? He asked slowly. I folded my hands calmly. I mean exactly what I said. I never approved the sale of Riverside Plaza. Ryan looked confused. That's impossible, he said. My agent spoke to the property manager last week. They confirmed the owners accepted the offer. I nodded slightly. They probably did. Ryan frowned harder. But you just said you own the building. That's correct. The investor who recognized me earlier crossed his arms. Then he asked Ryan a simple question. Who exactly do you think the final approval for that sale comes from? Ryan's face slowly started to change because he suddenly realized something. In large property deals, agents and managers can discuss terms, but only the actual owner signs the final contract. And that owner was standing right in front of him. Ryan turned back to me. So you're telling me you control the final decision? Yes. The room erupted into whispers. One investor leaned toward another and muttered, "This just got interesting." Ryan ran a hand through his hair. But the deal is already scheduled for tomorrow morning. I know, I said calmly. You knew? Yes. Ryan's voice started to rise. Then why didn't you say something earlier? I looked around the room at all the guests he had invited. The same people who had just listened to him laugh about his retired plumber father-in-law. I didn't want to interrupt your presentation, I said. A few people tried to hide their smiles. Ryan's face was now completely red. Look, he said nervously, lowering his voice. We can talk about this privately. I shook my head. There's nothing to talk about. The investors leaned in closer. Ryan swallowed. So, are you saying the deal is canceled? I nodded once. Yes. The word dropped like a hammer. One of the investors laughed quietly. Another whispered, "That's a $10 million mistake." Ryan looked like someone had just punched him in the stomach. But I already promised everyone here this opportunity. I stood up slowly. That sounds like a problem. Ryan's voice cracked. You can't just ruin this deal. I looked at him calmly. Actually, I can, because the building, the land, and every signature required to complete that deal belonged to me. And then I said something that made the entire room freeze, especially after hearing how you talk about the people who helped build your life. Ryan's confidence was gone now. But the worst part for him was still coming, because someone in the room suddenly asked a question that would make his situation much, much worse. Part 5 will reveal the moment the investors realize Ryan tried to sell a building he didn't control, and the consequences start immediately. Part 5. The investor's turn. For a few seconds after I said the deal was canceled, no one spoke. Then one of the investors at the table leaned forward. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. He looked directly at Ryan. "You told us the owner had already agreed to sell." Ryan tried to recover his confidence. "They did. The property manager confirmed it," he said quickly. The investor shook his head. "That's not how real estate deals work." He gestured toward me. "The owner makes the final decision." Rand's face was now completely pale. Another investor stood up from his chair. "So you invited all of us here tonight for a deal you didn't actually control?" The whispers in the room grew louder. Ryan looked around desperately. "I was close to finalizing it," he said. But the investor who had recognized me earlier laughed quietly. "Close doesn't mean done." He turned to me. "Mr. Carter, I apologize if our presence caused any discomfort." I nodded politely. "No offense taken." Ryan stepped closer to me. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Please," he said, "don't do this here." I looked at him calmly. "Do what?" "You're humiliating me in front of everyone." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the way he had laughed earlier. "That's just my wife's dad. A retired plumber." I looked around the room at the guests he had invited. "You did that yourself," I said quietly. Ryan clenched his jaw. One of the investors picked up his coat. "Well," he said, "I think this meeting is over." Another investor nodded. "If the owner isn't selling, there's no deal." Within minutes, people started leaving. The room that had been full of excitement an hour earlier now felt awkward and empty. Ryan stood frozen in the middle of the floor. His biggest deal, his biggest investors, all walking out the door. My daughter slowly approached me. "Dad," she said softly. But before she could say anything else, Ryan suddenly spoke again. His voice was bitter now. "You could have helped me," he said. "I'm family." I looked at him carefully. Family doesn't mock each other in front of a room full of strangers. He didn't respond, because he knew I was right. But the night still wasn't finished. As the last investor reached the door, he turned around and asked a question that changed the entire situation. And Rand's face went white the moment he heard it. Part 6 will reveal the investor's shocking proposal and why. Ryan suddenly realized he might lose much more than just a deal. Part 6. The offer no one expected. The last investor had almost reached the door when he suddenly stopped. He turned around and looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "before I leave, may I ask you something?" The entire room went quiet again. Ryan was still standing in the middle of the floor, looking defeated. I nodded. "Go ahead." The investor walked back into the room. "What if the building isn't sold?" he said, "but instead, we partner on the redevelopment project?" Ryan's head snapped up. "Partner?" he repeated. The investor nodded. "You already own Riverside Plaza. That's the hardest part of the project." He gestured toward the group of investors who had paused near the door. "We have the capital to renovate it." Then he looked at me again. "With your experience and our funding, we could turn that building into the most valuable property in the district." A few of the other investors nodded. "That's actually a great idea," one of them said. Ryan looked like he had been punched again, because he suddenly understood something. The deal he had spent months chasing was now being offered directly to me, without him. I crossed my arms thoughtfully. "That's an interesting proposal," I said. Ryan stepped forward quickly. "Wait," he said. "I was the one who brought everyone together tonight." No one answered him. The investor looked at me again. "We'd prefer to work directly with the owner." The meaning was clear. Ryan was no longer part of the conversation. My daughter stood beside him, looking embarrassed and confused. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you really considering this?" I smiled slightly. "I always consider good opportunities." Ryan's voice rose again. "This is my project." One of the investors shook his head. "No, Ryan." He pointed toward me. "It was always his." Ryan went silent. The reality had finally sunk in. The man he had introduced as just a retired plumber was now the most important person in the room. I walked toward the window and looked out at the city skyline. Riverside Plaza stood in the distance, a building I had owned quietly for years. Then I turned back toward the investors. "I'll think about your offer," I said calmly. The investor smiled. "That's all we ask." Ryan stared at me. For the first time that night, there was no arrogance left in his eyes, only regret. But the real lesson of the night wasn't about money. It was about something much simpler: respect. And before the night ended, Ryan finally said something he should have said from the beginning. But by then, it might have been too late. Part 7 will reveal Ryan's apology and the decision I made that changed our entire family. Part 7, The Apology. The last of the guests slowly began leaving the house. The loud music had stopped. The room that had once been full of laughter now felt strangely quiet. Ryan stood in the middle of the living room staring at the floor. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. My daughter gently touched his arm. "Ryan, say something," she whispered. He swallowed hard. Then he slowly walked toward me. "Mr. Carter?" he began. I raised an eyebrow. He stopped himself. Then he tried again. "Dad." The word sounded uncomfortable coming from him. "I owe you an apology. I didn't answer right away. Ryan took a deep breath. I shouldn't have spoken about you that way, he admitted. I was trying to impress my investors. I crossed my arms calmly. And mocking your family seemed like a good way to do that? He shook his head quickly. No, it wasn't. Ryan looked genuinely embarrassed now. I honestly didn't know about the properties, he said. That's the point, I replied quietly. You never cared enough to ask. The words hit him harder than anything else that night. My daughter stepped forward. Dad, please. Ryan made a mistake. I looked at her, then back at him. Respect isn't about money, I said. I spent 40 years working with my hands. I'm proud of that. Ryan nodded slowly. You should be. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Ryan asked something carefully. So, what happens now? I thought about the investor's proposal, the redevelopment project, the millions of dollars that deal could generate. But that wasn't what mattered most in that moment. What mattered was the lesson. I looked at Ryan and spoke calmly. I'm still considering the partnership offer. His shoulders dropped slightly. And you're not part of it. Ryan closed his eyes for a second. He already knew that answer. But then I said something else. Not yet. Ryan looked up, confused. If you want to be part of projects like this, I continued, you'll have to earn it. His voice was quiet. How? I smiled slightly. The same way I did, by starting at the bottom. Ryan stared at me. You want me to work? For you? Not for me, I corrected him. With me. For the first time that night, Ryan actually looked relieved, because the truth was simple. I could have destroyed his career in one evening. Instead, I was giving him a chance to build something real. But the final decision about our future together would come the next morning. And what happened during that meeting would change everything. Part 8 will reveal the next day's meeting with the investors and the decision that determines Ryan's future. Part 8, the meeting that changed everything. The next morning, I arrived at the downtown office building before anyone else. The investors had scheduled a meeting for 9 o'clock. By 8:45, they were already gathered in the conference room. Large glass windows overlooked the city skyline. Riverside Plaza stood clearly in the distance. The same building Ryan had tried to sell the night before. When I walked in, everyone stood up. Good morning, Mr. Carter, one of them said. Morning, I replied calmly. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Ryan walked in. He looked different today. No expensive suit. No confident smile. Just a simple shirt and a serious expression. He nodded politely to the investors. Good morning. Some of them recognized him from the party, but no one made any jokes. This was business now. I sat at the head of the table. Let's begin, I said. One of the investors opened a folder. We're prepared to invest in the redevelopment of Riverside Plaza, he explained. Luxury apartments, ground floor retail, and rooftop amenities. Another investor added, projected profit after renovation could exceed $25 million. Ryan listened quietly. Yesterday, he had been bragging about the project. Today, he wasn't saying a word. Finally, the investor turned toward me. "So the question is simple, Mr. Carter. Are you willing to partner with us?" Everyone looked at me. But before I answered, I looked toward Ryan. "You were the one who discovered the opportunity in the building," I said. The investors glanced at him. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair. "Yes," he said quietly. "So I have a question for you," I continued. The room waited. "If you were in my position, would you trust someone who mocked you in front of a room full of investors?" Ryan didn't hesitate. No. His honesty surprised everyone. "I wouldn't," he admitted. The investors exchanged looks. Ryan continued, "But I'd also say something else." I leaned back slightly. "What's that?" Ryan met my eyes. "I'd say people deserve a chance to fix their mistakes." The room went silent. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Then I slowly nodded. "That's true." The investors watched carefully, because they knew the next sentence would decide everything. I closed the folder in front of me. "The partnership is approved," I said. The investors immediately smiled. But before anyone could celebrate, I added something important. "Ryan will work on the project." Ryan looked shocked, but I finished my sentence. "As a junior project manager." The room chuckled softly. Ryan didn't complain. Instead, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, because he understood what this really meant. This wasn't a punishment. It was an opportunity. And the truth was simple. Sometimes the best lessons don't come from success. They come from embarrassment, especially when that embarrassment teaches you something you'll never forget. And Ryan would never forget the night he introduced me as just a retired plumber, because from that day forward, he made sure no one ever used the word just to describe another person again. The end.